Well, there we are, Tobias. Thank you for joining me on True 30 this morning. I'm really happy to have you. So I want to start by saying I really appreciated your use of metaphor and parable in your storytelling. It made the complexity of your subject far more digestible and discernible. So kudos on that, because it's very, very complicated. And it's also worth noting that you took 6 years to research and write this book. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Both, fortunately and unfortunately,
Yes.
my marriage, perhaps, but maybe fortunately for the reader.
Yeah. Well, it was worth it. Just let me say that. And so let me just start with the introduction, because this really kind of frames it up real well for our listeners to understand what it is. Your book, for those on YouTube, is called Outrage Machine: How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. It's a fantastic read. So in the introduction, your opening line in the intro says, "This book is about a machine designed to make you angry. It includes print media and digital media working in concert. It includes the device in your pocket. It includes newspapers and news feeds, algorithms and activists, politicians and pundits. This machine is our modern media system. This machine is not just made up of professionals. It also includes your neighbors, friends, and family members too. Without their knowledge, they have become participants in a continuous spectacle of news production and consumption. The rules are currently rigged against us." It's quite the intro, Tobias.
Spicy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, before we dive in, I just wanted to, as I mentioned off camera, it's such a wonderful book and it's so complex and there's so much research. So because I have a particular interest in journalism, we're going to focus more on media and journalism throughout the talk. But before we get there, I wanted to have you start out the conversation with your origin story that you shared not only in the book, but in the presentation you gave at Summit, which was some fantastic presentation, by the way. Can you just start with how all this began in a rice field in Cambodia?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. So when I was pretty young, I was 23 years old. I was, the years after college, I had a little bit of a job after college, but decided I wanted to go and travel the world. And I was backpacking through Southeast Asia. And while I was backpacking, beaches in Thailand, temples in Cambodia. When I went to Cambodia, a small Southeast Asian country, very poor place, I was wandering around and I met this Cambodian monk, who basically asked me to come out and visit his village in the middle of nowhere. And I was at that particular phase of my life where I was saying yes to just about anything and everything. And this monk, under the auspices of a community visit, he's a Buddhist monk. He ran a local monastery with a bunch of other monks, and he pulled me out to this little pagoda in the middle of nowhere. Again, just as kind of a community visit, like come meet my friends, my family. And when I got there, he kind of jumped me with a project. He had common council, village elders all gathered in this pagoda, who basically one by one stood up and said, "Thank you for coming. We're so grateful that you've agreed to help us rebuild our irrigation system. Thank you." And they're just effusive in their gratitude for me agreeing to help them rebuild this thing. I was like, "I'm sorry, what? No."
Yeah.
And I was there with a friend who I was there with, just traveling around, and we're both like, "What? This is weird. This doesn't make any sense at all." And basically, this monk he ran a local NGO, a local nonprofit, essentially, that was made up of villagers. And they had this large reservoir, this huge irrigation system that had been destroyed during the Civil War in that country. So it had been destroyed. The Khmer Rouge, this terrible, violent regime in the 70s, had basically brought the country into a kind of Maoist style cultural revolution that just decimated the whole country in this very, very substantial way. It was kind of like what happened in China, but with no competency or education, and it was really, really, really bad. It killed about a quarter of the people in the country, and just set them back by decades, many, many decades. And so this monk had somehow thought I could help them. I said no, but I said, look, I can I'll be an advocate on your behalf. I'm not a trust fund kid. I don't have a degree in hydrology. I'm not an engineer, but I do have the internet. And so what I'll do is I'll post something online and I'll send it to my friends and see if there's going to be any response, see if there's anything there. And so I wrote this post. At that time, it was an email form, and that it was like an impassioned plea talking about the history of this country and this experience I had meeting these monks. And it was as if a little bit of a moral fire had kind of come alight in my chest. I really felt for these guys. They were really trying to solve problems locally, and they really deserved help. And they were living on $2 per day. It was really just a very kind of worthy cause, it seemed. And that email, when I clicked send, went to my friends, and also went to a bulletin board system, which was a platform that a friend of mine had designed, which today you would recognize immediately as social media. But at the time, we didn't really have social media. It was like the earliest days of social media. I went to an early social media platform, and then it went viral. It went like lightly viral. It went friends of friends of friends to friends of friends of friends of friends. And suddenly I had dozens, hundreds of random people emailing me back saying, this is an amazing project. How can I help? What can I do? Wow. And so, engineers and friends that knew people that were engineers would reach out, funders would reach out, people just randomly out of nowhere would reach out. And so suddenly, with this kind of little explosion of connectivity and virality on this prototype social media platform, that friend who designed that platform went on to be one of the first engineers at Twitter, actually. So you get a sense of how early and cuspy this was in the days of social media. And because of that cascade of sudden support, I was able to. I basically ended up shifting my life's focus for that duration of time. I ended up living in Cambodia for almost 7 years, working on this project. Helping these monks rebuild this reservoir. What I thought would be, $20,000 ended up being $250,000. It was just a huge project, and really did this like explosion of virality in that early point in my life, just shifted my focus in a really meaningful way. And since then, I've been very much tangling with this idea of what it means to be hyperconnected. Like, what does hyperconnectivity do to us as individuals and as groups of people and as a species? Because it does do something strange. It's not like the old times, right? It's not like the old times where you wrote a letter and it went somewhere and you got some, might get one-to-one, support about something, or, it's a very, very different thing. Virality is a very different thing. And so that was the kind of inception point of this book. I've been studying it for the last, 10 years, 15 years, really trying to understand what it is that this stuff does to us. So that was the origin.
That's cool. And then you actually authored an article in December of 2019 at The Atlantic with Dr. Jonathan Haidt. And the article itself was called The Dark Psychology of Social Networks, which was a romping read, by the way. So well done. I enjoyed it. And as I shared with you off camera, I have a man crush on Dr. Haidt. I read his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics, in 2011. Been a big fan ever since. I'm also a member of the Heterodox Academy, because I just think I love what he's doing. For those who don't remember, my listeners know because I talk about him all the time. But the idea there is that social media itself, that even with your origin story, started out with more possibilities proving good. And that's kind of what most things do as far as a cyclical function, right? Where they start out good, they open to the masses, and then once the masses start to get in, things start to happen based on the human condition. And so you wrote, and this is in your in your piece, and I want to read it. It's Federalist number 10. It's John Madison's. He wrote about the fear of the power of faction, by which he meant strong partisanship or group interests that inflamed men with mutual animosity and made them forget about the common good. He thought that the vastness of the United States might offer some protection from the ravages of factionalism, because it would be hard for anyone to spread outrage over such a large distance, right? So Madison presumed that fascist or divisive leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but they'll be unable to spread a general conflagration throughout the other states, which, we got to give Madison a little credit that he didn't understand what social media technology would turn into, right? Right. So, and then, as I mentioned too, let's get back to your book for a second. You did a fantastic job explaining how misinformation is not a new thing. And because we have an hour, which I could go 5 hours with this book. You wrote at length about how society had to reorient itself after all these major inventions, starting with the printing press, how this radio disrupted in the 30s, television in the 50s, the computers in the 80s, and then the proliferation of computers in the 1990s. Social media kind of in the 2007, 2009 area where the like button and Twitter kind of came into fashion. And then this little box, this little supercomputer we hold in our purses and our pockets is now part of the local discussion. And I think you did a really good job of explaining this. And this is also from your article. Human beings evolved to gossip, preen, manipulate, and ostracize. We're easily lured into this gladiatorial circus. And I think that the neat thing about the shift from, what you did and the Arab Spring and all the the neat things that took place in the early internet social side have kind of come to, and again, to focus on journalism and politics. Can you talk a little bit about your story with Mr. Trump? Because I really enjoyed that part of your presentation, because I thought it really shared through an anecdote what we see today in 2024.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, every major media technology that we are introduced to goes through some period in which there's this collective euphoria around it, right? So in my book, I go and I map the history of different media disruptions. I take a selection of the ones that I think are the most disruptive and contemporary and influential in our lives. And they track on this pretty consistent kind of curve, adoption curve, in which there's this early euphoria. Everyone's very excited about having this new tool. Everyone thinks it's going to be incredible for the world. And the result is usually during that process of incredible adoption, there's also a bunch of bad actors that start taking actions using these tools to potentially push things in a more chaotic and disruptive direction. They try to, they try to, increase their kind of attentional market share, right? In the 1930s, there was a Catholic preacher. Most people don't know this. There was a Catholic preacher who had a radio station that was basically a proto kind of NPR radio station. It was entirely funded by the listeners. He was a Catholic priest who was very much about workers' rights, about economic education, and he was also basically a direct mouthpiece for the Nazi Party in the United States. And he reached up to a quarter of American households every single week. And he was hugely, hugely popular. He was one of the biggest media personalities in the country during that time. And we don't think about that with the radio. We think about, it's the radio, it's benign, it's this thing, it doesn't matter that much. But it actually had this huge negative impact. And if you look back at this history of different media disruptions, there is this explosion of kind of positive vibes and then a cascade of negative consequences that happen. And for the radio, it took actually some major interventions by the government to build the FCC to manage airspace, basically. They nationalized the spectrum and decided to not give him a license to actually promote his anti-Semitic views on the radio during that time, which wasn't actually intervention that existed beforehand. They're just like, okay, this thing called airspace, now we own it, and now you don't get any, and now you're off the air.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, crazy. So with Trump is an interesting example because I think Trump shows just how powerful social media has been in two ways, not just in this kind of connectivity and virality way that we're talking about, but how social media actually influences us. Mm-hmm. So if you look back at Trump's Twitter profile and you go all the way back to 2011, you can see Trump operating very much like a standard celebrity. He had a reasonably large following, but he used Twitter as kind of this basic kind of announcement mouthpiece situation where he's like, try Trump water, check me out on The View, look at my new development, that kind of thing. But something happened in July 2011 in which he posted something. He was watching Fox News. He got angry about something. And he posted something about Barack Obama being a radical. He's like, Barack Obama's a radical. And that suddenly got an enormous number, like 10x the number of retweets and comments and shares that he would have gotten otherwise. And that was enormous signal for him. So if you're tracking the number of kind of standard likes and comments that he was getting like 30, 40, 50 likes, retweets, shares, that kind of thing. And then it goes up dramatically when he posts this outrageous moment about Barack Obama. So as a signal processing machine, which we all are, right? And Trump is no different. He has always loved media attention, and he's always been kind of leaning into trying to get a media attention. This was new signal for him. He was angry, and people responded to it. His audience responded to it dramatically. He got 2,000 retweets, 3,000 likes from this one particular post. And within a week, he started posting more outrageous and incendiary things on the platform. And you can see this particular moment in which he went from like a standard celebrity Twitter user to an outrageous kind of incensed a person who is angry because his audience wants him to be angry. Mm-hmm. Because his audience is responding to that anger. And not everyone that was retweeting him or commenting on his post was agreeing with him, but it was attention. And that process sometimes, and there's a word for this called audience capture on social media. When we capture an audience online, we actually are captured by them as well, because we look for what they want and we start changing our behavior to maintain their attention and grow their attention potentially, right? And so that's what Trump is, this like encapsulation of this. You can see the version of Trump that became, he went from this kind of, this little bit of a blowhard kind of, media, showman to essentially outrageous and incensed public persona, because he was getting this constant engine of feedback from social media. And that did fundamentally change how he presents himself to the world. And I think that's happened to a lot of us, not just Trump. It's happened to a lot of different major celebrities. I think it's happened to Kanye. I think it's definitely happened to Elon. And this transition away from the person we know to this crazy version of the person we know is actually happening to a lot of people that spend most of their time on these platforms.
Do you think it's fair to say that audience capture makes the content producer a more extreme version of themselves?
Yes.
Is that really what it is?
Yeah.
And so like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was saying, I think it really does depend on your willingness as a content creator to express your own agency and interests in a way that is potentially counter to this reaction that your audience wants from you, right? It takes a moment. It's like when you could be angry about something and there's like a little fork in the road where you're like, this was kind of messed up, but I could say this was really messed up. I could say this was terrible. Can you believe this thing? And get people riled up about it. Or I can say, you know what? I can see it from both sides. This thing, it wasn't quite that bad. And your audience, people are more likely to orient their heads towards version A than they are towards version B. So it does require some kind of fortitude and some brake pumping from us as creators, I think, to not fall into that audience capture trap when it comes to outrageous and incendiary and conspiratorial content. Conspiracies are a great example of this, right? Like misinformation. Mm-hmm. If you can say something that's not true, right, you get a 5x increase in virality versus the true version of that fact. Right. So there's a study at MIT that was done a couple of years ago that shows that truth has a 5x disadvantage to lies about the same topic. And so if you're building an audience, go with a lie, right? If you're just building the audience without looking at the outcomes and just looking at the outcomes of numbers and not looking at the outcomes in terms of kind of quality of information, then you should definitely go with a lie. And that's bad.
And you talked a lot about that specific in the radio biz, not only Father Coughlin, who you mentioned, but Rush Limbaugh as well. So Rush Limbaugh being a very powerful figure in my upbringing, because my stepfather actually piped him through his basement where he worked. I could hear Rush every single day. And, as a liberal, I would listen and I'd be like, wow, that's crazy. Like, no one's going to believe that. But, I was wrong, 100% wrong. And that is true today in mass. right? You have Alex Jones, you have Donald Trump, you have Steve Bannon, you have, I mean, everybody who's out there talking about conspiracy theories and deep state and all of those. It's very viral. It's very popular. And you also talk about algorithms feeding that. And that's part of the social media machine itself. You want to talk a little bit about how algorithms play into that?
Yeah. So, we all know about algorithms. I think these days, algorithms used to be something that we did not, it's like algorithm, that's math. I don't understand it. It's computer science, whatever. I think we've all just in very recent years recognized the power of algorithms to shape our behavior and also kind of collective understanding of things. Look, algorithms are incredibly powerful. At Facebook, the very first engagement algorithm was called MSI, which stands for Meaningful Social Interactions. Mm-hmm. And it was a fairly simple, kind of transparent algorithm that operated based on just a couple different parameters of how likely you were to engage with a certain type of piece of content, whether or not the creator of that content was someone that you engaged with in the past, whether or not it was something that other people like you had clicked on. It was like this very kind of transparent, understandable algorithm. And it very quickly actually started to do weird things with our news feeds. And if you remember what it was like to be on Facebook in like 2012-ish, when they really started to juice the algorithm and make it more effective at capturing attention, keeping people on time on site longer, there was this period in which, and it was, I remember very clearly because I would open up Facebook. And like Facebook before that point felt like a real utility. It felt like this kind of beautiful, effective utility for keeping track of my friends, for sharing funny memes, for finding your photos of your friends. And it felt like almost this kind of cohesive community tool that was just like, it was keeping me and my community together and connected. And different social media platforms go through different iterations in which their utility changes based on the audience and the people that are using it, and also the types of features that are deployed. So when they deployed the engagement algorithm, the feed became very sticky. So like you looked at it and the thing that was on top, usually it was number one, number two, was something that someone was angry about. It was like someone was pissed off about something. It didn't matter what it was. It was like a harm or an offense or something they saw in the news or something they saw on social media. And it was just, it became this very sticky and outrageous place. And I remember being like, whoa, this is weird. Like I can't put down my phone. And also, like it was this, this kind of horrific new attractor, right? Suddenly for a lot of people. And Facebook and Twitter, both around the same time, started experimenting with engagement algorithms and quickly found out that outrage is an inherent attractor of attention in this very fundamental way. So it's this very easy way for, if you think about an engagement algorithm a bit like a dog that's going out to fetch content, right? And the dog is just looking for signals from you. It's like going out to fetch a sock, a newspaper, a bone, whatever those things are. And it fetches you an outrageous, kind of piece of information, an outrageous piece of news about what your neighbor did to his wife. You're going to be like, whoa, this is crazy. And the dog is going to keep out and go on and try to find more content like that in the future. And right. I think it's important to put these in kind of in context that we understand. These are incredibly powerful algorithms, but the basic function of them is that they are just going out to find the thing that is most a most substantial attractor to our attention. And it turns out, outrageous content tends to receive a 17% boost, right, to virality when you share it. So if you use moral and emotional language on a platform that includes engagement algorithms like that, the contours of the platform include engagement algorithms, moral language like disgust, shame, anger, children, punishment, all of these different moral and emotional words, you will get a 17% boost in how that content spreads per one of those words that you use, right? So again, if we're creating a whole lot of content on a regular basis, right, and we're plugging into these algorithms, and those algorithms are feeding us back good positive signal from being angry, then actually the research shows that people will end up doing it more in the future. They'll end up expressing more moral outrage in the future. So it's training us to be more angry than we would be otherwise.
And because we're disembodied, we have more bravery and more ability to be mean-spirited as a human, right? Because they're not there in front of you. You can't see how disappointed they are when you make them feel bad, or vice versa. And you shared a 2016 study that showed the vast majority of Facebook and Twitter users, 94% of Facebook and 89% of Twitter, reported that when they log onto social media, they see at least some political content. And to your exact point, Republicans did this disgusting thing, and Democrats are wrecking America, right? Those are the kind of headlines that get populated, and those are the kind of headlines that people share with each other. So if I'm a Republican, I'm going to share the Democrats are wrecking America because of their liberal beliefs, and how dare they, and shame on them. And then same thing, if I'm a Democrat, Republicans did this disgusting thing. I hate them. They're bad people. We're better. And that's kind of what we're seeing today in our culture, which is pretty scary. And now we can kind of pivot a little bit to the news biz, because as I shared with you off camera, I spent 20 plus years in the media business, in advertising and marketing and branding. And so we did a lot of this old school stuff. We used to call it A/B testing for headlines. Right? So if we're putting a headline out there, we would just test a word or a phrase that seemed to capture more audience. And these were done in a lot of times qualitative focus groups and even quantitative studies, but they weren't in real time, much like we're doing now, because everything now, and AI is even more of an example, where you just feed the words in to say, hey, I want these words used not only in my content as an author, but I want to make sure my headlines also hit those numbers, because obviously I want to make sure that people see what I write. I want to propagate it to the best of my ability. That's how that works. And then you mentioned in one of your interviews, and I can't remember which, but I watched a couple of them. You mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, you talked to a modern day publisher who said, we don't worry about the biases of our audience. We figure out how to ride those biases to our benefit. And that was in part some of the news companies that have had a lot of problems of late. BuzzFeed News filing bankruptcy, Vice News filing bankruptcy, Intercept is on the verge. Messenger, which was a really big startup, started with $50 million last May of 2023, and went bankrupt 7 months later. And so the idea behind the business of news, specifically old school Hegelian dialectic news, in the sense that you have a thesis and a synthesis and an antithesis, and you're looking at that and figuring out, how do we share the truth? That's no longer profitable, right? And it was one of those things where, how do you see the news business today based on these issues? Do you see that as part of the demise, as the companies I mentioned with BuzzFeed and Vice? Is that part of what you saw with the collapse of online digital news?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. When we've been talking about what the algorithms do to us, and what social media does to us as individuals, it turns out our entire media system, as these tools have become more powerful and more effective, they have basically oriented our whole media machine around the propagation of these same game mechanics, right? So the same thing that makes us angry as for posting something disgusting will make a news organization orient their entire reporting towards the more disgusting, more angry, more outrageous thing. And so that was I think the bigger moment of reckoning that happened. I want to say it happened around 2015, 2016, 2017 for some people, but the recognition that, oh no, like these whole systems of outrage, and social media was a side player for such a long time. It's like, oh, this is nice to use. Yeah, we can use this to optimize our audience. We can use this to, juice our numbers a little bit. We can use this to gain market share. We can use this to, this is a great tool for us to drive traffic. But not recognizing how powerful some of those ingrained mechanics were in shifting our coverage and perception towards more outrageous content. And I think you can think about it in terms of like the preferences of any given audience, right? And like back in the day, in the olden days, and from the book, I go into the history of early newspaper, like print journalism, to try and understand how did this old outrageous system of print journalism, which used to print fake news all the time, which used to get people extremely upset, and just to sell papers. Yeah, yellow journalism, the penny presses, all that stuff. How did that turn into this, capital J journalism that is this hugely, prestigious sort of institution that we trust, historically, up until recently, I think, right? Until we started to not trust it at all, unfortunately. So it turns out there was a bunch of things that happened that I think we're kind of going through a similar transition in right now with you're talking about the demise of BuzzFeed and these other places where the more biased your coverage is, the more extreme your coverage is, your audience is in this a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma with the news producers, right? So it's like you can't go so far afield in your reporting before your audience breaks with you and starts to kind of like be like, I don't know, you can't trust that, but you can't trust that particular news organization, right? There needs to be there's kind of like an acceptable range of discourse that if you break that, if you break out of that acceptable range of discourse, then people will unsubscribe from your papers, they will stop buying your news, they will stop watching you on TV, that kind of thing. But outrage is an interesting one because the things that if you think about the spectrum of audience preferences and that kind of acceptable range of discourse, there are a few people on the edges of that acceptable range. You have the extreme left, extreme right. There's a few people that are very angry about things within that audience, right? And if you can tailor your reporting specifically to that subset of angry people, if you can get them very angry about it, you might lose some of the centrists. And you're definitely going to lose some of the people on the other side of the political aisle, but you can actually turn up the engagement to a degree where they become kind of loyal but outraged subscribers to your base, right? And we've been in this process of kind of fragmentation in our media environment, for the last 10 years, and longer. I think you could say since the 90s. It's been happening with cable news, with Rush Limbaugh, essentially, when we lost the fairness doctrine, when we lost these other pieces of legislation that mandated
equal coverage,
equal coverage, essentially, on both sides. And so you could say that this kind of fragmentation has been happening slowly for a long time, but the internet really did allow for it to happen on a much, much more precise level, social media specifically, a much, much more precise level than it ever has before. And I was really shocked when I was doing research for this book. Like you said, this quote from this millennial focused online publisher who said, basically our job is not to check your biases. Like our job is to ride those biases, find them, and then ride them as far as they can possibly go, because that is where the money is and that is where the ad revenue is. And everyone that is not doing this in general at this moment in time is losing out, is going bankrupt, is dying. And I think we're starting to kind of see some. There is this fragmentation that's been happening. We lost a lot of people on the right, lost a lot of people on the left, but there are some openings, I think, for discourse-oriented reporting, right? As you were just talking about, right? So where it is actually like, oh no, like this is conflict, but it's not toxic conflict, right? It's not like oh, this is not dehumanizing conflict. It's like people are actually addressing these issues and trying to have a discourse, a conversation back and forth, a dialectic, if you will, and trying to address these issues. But it is this. I mean, it's weird to think about how uncommon this like the last century of reporting has been, right? We've kind of had this, we've been living, everyone alive, almost everyone alive today, who's like an adult today, grew up in this kind of epistemic environment in which we had this monopoly on shared reality, essentially, through our media systems, right? And there was good things about that, and there was bad things about that, right? There was this kind of consensus function machine where it's like you had the headlines, you had the Associated Press, you had Reuters, you had these very kind of established media entities that were consortiums of very, very powerful media organizations that got together, and not through any kind of malice, but because there was like this efficient process of gathering information and trying to like help us understand the news on a daily basis. And that, I think that kind of that collective window of shared discourse is probably broken for the foreseeable future. It's probably not going to come back together in the very near future. But I think there's possibilities for building new tools. I do think that social media needs to be a part of this for helping us shunt together shared or different realities into the same reality. And I think that this is kind of the challenge of our times, because if we aren't able to share these basic facts, if we do keep on fraying out to the edges of these extremes, then yeah, democracy is not a function. It can't work the way it is. Yeah, it's not functional.
No, and I like, obviously as a reporter, I kind of know a little bit more about this, but what I liked about your book in that sense is that you shared the history, not only of Benjamin Day, who was like the first penny press kid who was 23 years old and he's just a brash entrepreneur, and he started the New York Sun. But I think that the New York Times itself was started in 1851 by Henry Jarvis Raymond and a banker named George Jones. And their actual motto was, "We shall be conservative in all cases where we think conservatism essential to the public good. And we shall be radical in everything which may seem to us to require treatment and radical reform. We do not believe that everything in society is either exactly right or exactly wrong. What is good, we desire to preserve and improve. What is evil, to exterminate or reform." And that was, in 1851. And as you talked about briefly, people always have this more romanticized version of what newspapers used to be, the Walter Cronkite thing. And in your book, you chronicled how we basically had three networks, with ABC, NBC, and CBS at the time. And if we were mad together, right? Because we watched all of those things. And that's your quote from your book. But the idea there, which I thought was really unique, is that people need to understand that, because we're not doing something new here, right? Yellow journalism was really, really toxic back then. It's really toxic today. It hasn't really changed in that sense. Have you heard of the book Bad News by Batya Ungar-Sargon?
I have, yeah, I've heard of it. Mm-hmm. I've not read it.
It's a good book, and I've actually had a couple podcasts on it. And she goes after what you very elegantly talked about, specific to audience capture. The New York Times has 91% of its subscribers are Democrats. So to your point, there's a boundary, right? And when they push back on like BLM finances, as an example, they got hammered. Unsubscribe, you're terrible people. They pushed back the Tom Cotton op-ed piece that launched a whole bunch of hoopla over there. It was Barry Wise's reason for leaving. It was James Bennett was fired. I mean, who was the editor at the time of the op-ed team. And do you think that that's part of the journalistic problem today, specific to the business model, is that if you want to go, I mean, reporters by definition and by historical norms are very curious people. They like to explore the story. And even if they are a Democrat or a Republican, it's not that important specific to the story. They want to make sure the story is out there for themselves. But if you have a social graph as a young journalist at the New York Times and you have 100,000 followers on your own, on Twitter and Facebook, and you write a story that you know is going to affect your audience in a negative way, you may not want to publish the story. And now there's tons of stories out there. Nellie Bowles just published a new book called Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. I'm about halfway through it. It's a scathing indictment on the internal mechanisms within the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And then there was Yuri Berliner, who just wrote a piece in the Free Press about the same thing taking place at NPR. I mean, you're seeing this across the board around more left-leaning publications. And, to be fully transparent, publications that I've listened to and read for many years. And so it's one of those things where, how do you see us getting out of that based on this extraordinary amount of homework you've done? I mean, what does that look like to crawl out of this hole that we've gotten into on the journalism front?
Yeah. I mean, look, I do think that this audience segmentation that's happening, it's happening to us as individuals. It's also happening to these news organizations in a very meaningful way. And yeah, we're becoming more ideologically aligned with or clustered with these particular news outlets, right? And that's, I think, where these people are going. We have the selection now. We have the ability to select many things. I don't think that is the biggest problem.
Okay.
I do think it is. I think it is a huge problem for sure, but I don't think it's the biggest problem. I think a bigger problem is really the fundamental lack of checks on real lies, like actual straight up lies. Not so much the ideological preference and selective reporting, but the actual fake information, like the actual bad, like legitimately false shit that is covered. And there's a whole range of things here, right? Like there's a whole range of things that are bad, right, about this transition. But I think it's really important for us to prioritize the degree of bad in these different categories, because we've had ultra biased reporting in the past. We've had extremely outrageous commentary in the past. We've had all of these things to some degree. But I think that as long as people adhere to some fundamental foundations of fact, and that there is a baseline of fact, even the most extreme kind of rhetoric on top of that fact isn't enough for us to get violent. I think that violence and misinformation, like actual true misinformation, real misinformation, are very, very closely linked. And if you look back at history, the times in which we've been the most violent as a species have been the times in which we have had huge quantities of mis and disinformation. So misinformation being just kind of spontaneous, incorrect information that spreads, disinformation being specifically engineered information to confuse, agitate, upset people. And if you look at the history of, major conflicts, major wars, ethnic pogroms, tribal conflict, all of these things, they come down to one group of people having really bad information about another group of people. And I think that the stoking of outrage and the stoking of taking the facts and then putting an editorial slant on top of them and saying that this is wrong, this is disgusting, this is problematic. I think that's actually that's okay. I think it's still okay as long as it's based on truth, right? I think that really dangerous stuff comes when it's not based on fact. And so this is the kind of primary takeaway from my homework right in this book, as you say, is that actually misinformation and disinformation are very, 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 very bad things for our species, for our understanding of the world. And we require a little bit of it, right? This is the byproduct of free speech. We require some quantities of falsehood to kind of be in the system, to have a little error bar to go outside of and inside of. It's like, this is right, this is actually wrong. This is right, this is actually wrong, right? So we can go through this corrective process, and we're not always right in our first assumption about a thing, right? We're not always right in the first reporter. If you're, there's this, this saying in journalism, it's like, if you're wrong, you're not first, right? Because you're always trying to be first, right? You're always trying to get the scoop, try to get the story. But if you're wrong, you're actually not, you weren't first. You didn't get the scoop. You actually messed up. You didn't do it right. And that's, there are these kind of this history of norms in journalism, which really do put truth over and above other things, right? Over and above the propagation of falsehood. So of anything else. So the truth is the number one goal in the history of kind of journalistic standards and ethics. And so I was really curious about how we actually got to that point with journalistic standards and ethics. And then through that kind of effort, it's like, we understand journalism has problems, right? Certainly there's too much opinion. Certainly there's too many polemics. There's too many pundits. There's too many, there's too much outrage. There's too much audience kind of segmentation and orientation. But I think the fundamental issue is that the kind of the background radiation of falsehood is enough to really make people more upset and more angry and more anxious and more potentially violent than they would be otherwise, right? If you look at the people that are willing to commit violence, they are the ones that are actually touched by real falsehoods. And I don't mean just egregious interpretations of a news story. I mean, like actual real falsehoods. And that's I think that's the core of it is finding out and figuring out the ways to improve the epistemic balance. And I have some suggestions around that. Fortunately, I think there are some ways of doing that, which I think I've spoken about in the past. But this is not just about kind of the ideological slant of organizations. I think that the primary issue is actually is falsehood.
Yeah, and just for those who don't know, that there's the 3 C's of journalism, which are collaboration. Did it really happen? Go out and find that as a journalist. Curation. What is important? What do we put above the fold? And for those not in the media, it's above the fold of the newspapers where it came from, and or online if your website. It's what's the most important feature? What's the headline? What's the big story? And then the critical opinion is, why does it matter? Right? Those are the 3 C's of journalism. And in your book, you did something which I'm wonderful. I hadn't seen this for a long time, but journalism is the first draft of history is a famous adage. But you talked about something called the journalistic safeguards, which I think you were kind of alluding to here. The correction cycles, how long it takes for revisions to be accepted, narrative to be published. And the Swiss cheese defense, as chronicled, and I love Jonathan Rush's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, and I've talked about that on my podcast too, but there's a hypothetical falsehood might have a 50% chance of making it to print through these standards. And the same falsehood would have a 25% chance of making it through the second journalistic filter and 12% of making it through a third paper. So the neat thing about that is that journalism itself has this Swiss cheese defense, and that as an industry and as a people, we try to make sure that the stories we put out and propagate have been, in fact, looked at and fact-checked and put up to our editor, who's asked us those same questions numerous times. I want 3 sources. Go get them. Let me see them. I want to understand them. This story seems dubious. That kind of thing does happen. And in defense of the New York Times, which, again, I have bias there, they put out 200 articles a day. So I think their opinion pages have kind of taken that over, specific to its vibe in the culture, but they do have really good reporting. They have great structures, and they do have the journalistic safeguards that you mentioned in your book. And you talk specifically about why these safeguards are so important. And there's a great parable, because I love the way you use parables. Do you want to talk about the parable of the island that you share in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. Just a note on the Swiss cheese defense. I think, like, just to give a hat tip to Jonathan Rauch on that. I think that his book, The Constitution of Knowledge, if you're interested in the deeper kind of epistemic foundations of how we know what we know as a species, it's a very, very powerful read, and such an important book for understanding what it is that we're facing right now. And that filter, the Swiss cheese defense is such a great analogy. This slice of Swiss cheese that, like, you can't, you have different holes where misinformation goes through one side,
right?
But you have another layer of Swiss cheese, it doesn't go through the next one, which is the next paper, and another layer of Swiss cheese, it doesn't go through the next one and then the next paper. Because journalism together is basically this kind of like collective bullshit detection mechanism, right? It's like a bunch of people who are competitively trying to call each other out on bullshit, right? And if you talk to journalists, right, that's kind of their job. It's like Kevin, I've talked to a bunch of people I know. I researched a ton. I talked to a lot of journalists for this book, and one of them was like, my job is to be professionally annoying. I want to go out and just be annoying and ask the questions that other people aren't asking, and it's my job to find out where people are wrong and correct them on that. And if you have a whole bunch of people that are paid to do that, then you actually get this kind of this lifting of all ships, right? And it's not fun when you get called out by someone for saying something that was wrong, right? It doesn't feel good when you're corrected.
No.
But it is how we understand the truth. It's how our species has actually learned to figure out what is real and what is not real, because we are not good at truth on our own. We are not good at understanding reality on our own. We require other people to help us see the truth. So the parable of the island, I'll go over pretty quickly, but I use a lot of parables, metaphors in the book, and this is a parable about basically a group of people, and I tried to make it kind of the smallest possible democracy, right? It's a group of people on an island that are kind of 5 different farms on an island, and they are collectively oriented. They're trying to be a collective government, and they have a democracy. They elect an executive, once every few years. But the island is just big enough that they can't they know each other, but they only see each other like maybe once a year, right? So they're on this island, they only see each other once a year. And since the island is so big, but there's a road that goes around the island, there's like infrastructure on the island, they need someone to help them understand what's wrong with the island so they can fix it. So they pay a guy to go out and just like take stock of what's wrong around the island, right? And then once a year the person that goes around and figures out what's wrong around the island tells the executive what's wrong and tells the other farmers what's wrong, and then the executive fixes it, right? And they vote on the executive every few years or whatever. All right. So this is good. Like, this is a good system. It tends to work pretty well. Of course, the analogy here is that the reporter man is journalism. The executive is a president or a leader of a democracy. But all right. So what happens when this island is sold a radio antenna? All right. And there's this guy a salesman comes along and he sells this island a radio antenna and gives everyone a little radio that they can use to basically communicate without the reporting man. So for a little while there, everyone thinks this is good. It's all great. They have a little radio system they can use to kind of keep track of what's going on the island. And there's one of these farmers on the island that is basically, he's always been just a little bit of an asshole. Like, he's always been a little bit of he's just like, oh, I want to be the executive. I want to be the guy ahead. But he's never found he's not super popular on the island, but he's always saying that shit's going wrong on the island. The executive is could be better. I should be the executive on this guy. And one year he finds some oil on his land, but recognizing it's an island, there's probably oil all over the island. So he tries to hatch this plan. He basically starts to say that things are false, that the reporter man has been reporting on, in this goal to basically get the election and to control the island to get these oil rights. Long story short, he's able to, with this radio, this new tool, right, which is of course now just an analogy for social media, he's able to confuse people by constantly and consistently telling people that things are not done where they should be done, right? He's able to kind of use the radio to say like, oh, well, this other thing over here, you can't trust this person, you can't trust this person, you can't trust. And so he sows discontent using this tool. Eventually they get rid of the reporting man and it's just them using the radios. And when just them using the radios, this one single guy can elevate the confusion enough to keep other people from voting, can keep other people from engaging in the democratic process, essentially, and can force himself into power because he had some abstentions in the voting process, and all of a sudden is now the executive and is able to run the island the way he wants. And this is of course a parable of what happens in democracies around the world. And you can look at what's been happening in Russia recently. This also happened is happening in many, many, many countries that have been flirting with democracy, that have had some democratic norms in the past, that basically there's a small group of people, person or group of people that are willing to turn up the anger and confusion to a degree, right? That it starts to peel away enough people on the edges away from the democratic process. So they're like upset by a thing. It's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't vote. They're confused by a thing. Oh, I don't know if you can trust. You can't trust that guy. Maybe I just trust this guy because this guy's loud and he's obnoxious, but he's like, at least he's telling the truth. And so democracy starts to get muddy because people can't really tell what is happening. And that is unfortunately what social media has done, is allowed for a small number of people to pollute the shared water of discourse enough that you can't really see what's going on, right? You can't really see what's going on. So you just kind of go with your gut. You're like, well, you can't really trust that guy. That person was like, her emails basically, right? Like right. from Hillary, right? Like in my mind, as I grew up in California, like history of being a Democrat, but like it still felt like something icky and gross is happening there. It's like, oh, her emails, it must be like there's something wrong, right? Like her emails, like turns out, no, it was just like a shitty documents management case. Same thing that Trump did when he was president as well, ostensibly, but like it felt gross and it felt problematic because if you say something enough times that is loud enough, then it starts to pollute the idea in general. It starts to pollute the person in general. It starts to pollute the idea of voting for that person. And that is what social media has done in democracies around the world. And they've trended towards authoritarianism as a result of that, because people are just like, I don't know what you can trust. You can't really trust it. So let's go with the guy, let's go with that. And this is what I'm talking about the problems with mis and disinformation. They are just fundamentally toxic to democracy. We need a little bit of it, but if you have too much of it, then people just start exploiting it and they start making people confused to gain power on their own.
I know you have a little bit of time left, so let me ask you this. You mentioned some remedies specific to Section 230 and things like that. Why don't you talk a little bit about, again, I wish I had more time with you, but give me a couple of your remedies specific to this.
Yeah, so I go through. I have a lot of remedies. I do have a lot of, and you saw one of my presentations in which I speak about some of the specific remedies. I put them into 3 different buckets: things we can do as individuals, things we can do at a policy level, and then things that platforms can do. And categorically, there's a lot that can be done. And I'm actually very excited about solutions. People talk about this being kind of an intractable problem. This is not intractable. This is absolutely something we can solve. I'll speak to the policy stuff just really quickly because I think that's actually helpful. And then I can talk about just a little bit of the platform stuff. But from a policy level, I think that at least a third of the discourse issues we're facing right now, maybe up to half of them. And I mean, that's a huge quantity of the issues we're facing. Like a third of the mis and disinformation problems we're facing right now have come from a particular carve out in a law that was passed in 1996. So 1996 was the last year in which we had meaningful legislation in and around any kind of internet law, right? We didn't have any, like in 1996, they wrote this piece of legislation called CDA 230, Communication Decency Act, Section 230, in which basically they said they could see these early internet platforms getting large and also becoming targets for liability, right? Targets for lawsuits for people that didn't like what they were seeing on the platforms. So Section 230 basically gave platforms blanket immunity to both moderate content the way they saw fit, and also to avoid any kind of lawsuits for the stuff that their users would post, right? So for user-generated content on the platform, which was the right law for the right time. It was a great law. They did not foresee the fact that that social media companies were going to be the primary drivers of discourse for our species in the next, in the next 20 years, 20, 30 years. And it has become a fundamental problem for how we understand the truth now today. So what I mean by that is social media companies have far, far less liability for algorithmically amplified content, right? So for the news feeds, you see they have zero liability if they want to put, suicide-inducing content into your children's feeds. They have no legal liability. If they want to, put absolute falsehoods about a presidential candidate into your feeds, they have no liability for that. And the way I think about this is in terms of the liabilities associated with newspapers or cable companies. They all have liability for what they produce and put out there. If you look at what happened with the Dominion case at Fox News after the election, Dominion sued Fox for defamation based on what Tucker Carlson was saying on the platform, and they had to pay out this huge settlement because there was liability involved. Right? Tucker is now on X; he can say whatever he wants, and no one is liable. Tucker's not even really liable in that particular situation because his personal opinion, it's freedom of speech. It doesn't matter in that situation, right? So, but the algorithmic decisions that are being made by these companies to put certain content in your feeds is the same type of decision that an editor is making or would be making at a cable company, like a cable news organization. Like what headlines do we put first, right? What do we put above the fold? What news do we put at the very front page of our paper, right? These are the same types of editorial decisions that are being made on a daily basis for far more people far more people, billions of people are being exposed to the editorial decisions made by algorithms, and there's zero liability associated with that. So we really do need a very simple reform, which is we need a carve out in Section 230 for algorithmically generated and bot generated content. So basically, if something was prioritized and served to you by an algorithm, right? That is certain. There's a clear demarcation between chronologically served content and algorithmically served content, right? There's a clear demarcation between those things. Algorithmically served content includes editorial decisions that the company should be liable for, right? It includes bot-generated content. You can get into ways of reducing harms from AI in a meaningful way there as well. And those two specific carve out for this really specific type of content would dramatically, I think it would clean up within a year or two, it would dramatically improve the information environment that we live in today. I think it would make these companies pay more attention to the truth. They know what the problems are. All right. Much of the time, and Frances Haugen showed this with her whistleblower complaint, they know much of the time what the bad content is, but they have no incentive to change it. Right? They have no financial incentive to change it, no legal incentive to change it. And so simply changing this law and making it a carve out for Section CDA 230 and make them liable for algorithmically generated and algorithmically created content, I think that would dramatically clean up the broader ecosystem.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, I figured that. I know you'd go off on that because that's something 230 has been one of the things we've been talking about for decades now. What about on the personal side?
So on the personal side, fortunately, I mean, like I think there's a range of things that we can do to reduce our triggers in these systems and within these systems. I think it's really, really important to recognize that if you are on social media, you are addicted to social media. Very, very, very few people actually have a healthy relationship with these tools. They might try to convince themselves it's a healthy relationship, but if you look at your screen time, the average adult spends like a fifth or to a sixth of their waking life on social media, right? I mean, that's a huge amount of time, and that is not a healthy relationship, I want to say, right? And these are different rooms that you are living in that have different rules from this reality. And those rules are not good for your discourse, your mental health, your sense of self, your confidence. It is just not a good place to reduce spending so much time. Now, what I use a bunch of content blockers to just help me mitigate the amount of time that I use these tools. There's one tool that I use regularly called OneSec, ONESEC, that basically forces me to take a deep breath before when I auto click the app that is causing me that I'm addicted to. And I do it for news apps. I do it for social media apps. I do it for all of the apps. It takes like 5 minutes to set up. It'll save you dozens of hours of your life. Incredibly important. There's another app called Opal, which is a really good one. It's a hard content blocker during working hours, during daytime hours. It'll allow you to get in there when you need. But we need more frictions in place to help us be healthier and manage these tools more effectively. And I think we'll get there. It's just one of these things that it requires a lot of effort to recalibrate our defenses, right? There's this one thing I say, which is disgust equals delete. All right. If you feel disgust after like picking up your phone and like blacking out for 2 hours, and like, what the hell just happened? I was just, and like it happens when you're tired, when you're emotionally distressed, when you're hungry, like that's when the algorithms really get us. That's when they just suck us in, and then we're in there and we don't know how to get out. I think we've all had these kind of doom scrolling moments where we're just like, we know we're doing something wrong and we're just still in it, and you're just your eyes are crossing, but you can't get out. In those moments when you finally do break out and you feel that level of disgust equals delete. Disgust is a powerful emotion and is a really important one for managing your time on these tools. And so delete it for a period of time, come back to it, install these content blockers, put these frictions in place. And you can, they're powerful tools. We can't deny that. They're incredibly powerful tools, but you need to have a healthy relationship with them.
No, that's great, buddy. And I'll say this, it was a pleasure meeting you at Summit. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I wish we had more time because the book itself has so many wonderful pieces of research, little nuggets that help you understand what's going on with social media, what's going on with our discourse as a society. And your remedies at the end are worth it alone. So for those of you, I'll put this in the show notes, but Outrage Machine is the name of your book. Good luck with the remainder of your tour. congratulations again on your new baby girl. And thanks again for coming on the show, Tobias. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Joey. This is a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Cheers.